So this is Economist, Marxian professor of economics, Richard Wolff, Dr. Richard Wolff, and I'm going to have him break down, what this bill is and the significance, the historic significance of this bill passing and what it means for the labor movement.
Proposition 22. And the basic point of that proposition, which passed in California, even though California went overwhelmingly for Joe Biden, it allows Uber, Lyft, and other service car or vehicle driving entities to treat their workers as contractors rather than as employees, something often called the contract economy or the gig economy, words like that. I want to drive home to you that this is extremely important. It is a defeat for the entire working class, and that means the majority of us here in the United States, the overwhelming majority of us who are employees, whatever legal label is attached to it. What Uber and Lyft got was an exemption. They don't have to protect their workers, their employees, by the simple device of calling them something else. You're not my employee. You're a service provider with whom I have a contract. You're a gig worker. And in case there was ambiguity, and of course there was, and in case there were lawsuits, and of course there were, here is a ballot. The people voted to allow them what? To exempt workers from, and here's the key point, 150 years in this country, maybe more, during which working people fought like hell for all kinds of protections. You know, the length of the working day. So you can't be made to work more than 8 hours a day because that's the law. That had to be fought for in this country for a long time. That you can't be physically abused, that you can't hire children, that you can't impose on your workers sexual services through a harassment procedure, that you have to have a toilet, that you have to have clean air, that you can't verbally abuse. You get the picture? Loads of protections. And a lot of those protections, insurance policies, so if a worker gets hurt, all of those protections apply to employees, and Uber and Lyft don't want to pay those costs. They don't mind that their workers are therefore not protected. It's profit in their pocket because they don't have to pay for the protections. That's what the law was there to force them to do, and they just got out of the law. And you know what's going to happen now? 49 other states are going to see the same effort made in those states. And man, if it can work in California, it's going to be easier in many other states for all the reasons you know. And is it only the Uber Lyft type of business? No, anybody now who employs a worker to do a service can try to reclassify that worker as a gig worker rather than an employee, saving them money. This is an attempt to roll back the history of working people 150 years in this country. Make no mistake. That's why Uber, Lyft, and the others spent over $200 million on this obscure little vote. And here's the punchline of punchlines. Many people were told in California to do this, pass this, because it'll enable poor people to get a job driving a car because they're having such a hard time. And a lot of the vote that gave this gift to business were well-intentioned people who wanted to provide an opportunity. You know, it's like those people in Florida who voted to raise the minimum wage. Think about it. An ad on the TV screen. Don't you want to help a poor person make a living driving a car for their family? Reminds me of nothing so much as 100 years ago, when to keep child labor going in America, the awful process of making 5, 6, 7-year-old kids work all day in a rat-infested sewing shop. And you know what the ads then said? Poor people need for their children to work. If you don't let their children work, they'll be even poorer. Yeah, you frame the question that way, and you can pull off the kind of defeat of the working class. Something needs to be done to undo this. And the legislatures in California and across the country, and maybe a job for the new Biden administration, is to take steps to prevent this from happening. Federal law can trump, pardon the expression, state law. That needs to be done.
All right, so that was Richard Wolff, and just breaking down the the effects of this California's Prop 22. He gave a lot of information there. Some of the highlights of that, I think were that Uber and Lyft spent $200 million on this effort. So Uber and Lyft were willing to spend $200 million. Of course, where does that $200 million come from? That $200 million comes from the profit that they generate from those employees working for them. So what do? These companies in a capitalist system take the money, the surplus of your labor that you work for, and they take that money that you work for and they turn around and use that money to oppress you, to hold you down, to damage you and your family, to make sure that you don't get treated like an employee in the system. And so I think that's a really key thing to look out for in why capitalist systems are machines that continue to run this way, is because as long as you work under capitalism, you are going to continue to work in a system where you give your money to somebody else who might not have your best interest at heart, and they get to decide what to do with the surplus of your labor. In a democratic workplace, it just doesn't happen. In a democratic workplace, that means that all of those drivers have a democratic say in that. Are you going to decide to designate yourself as some worser designation, so that you lose the protections of like a minimum wage? They don't have to guarantee you a minimum wage when you work for Uber. You can go out for Uber and you could spend 2 hours and not get a single ride, and they don't have to pay you anything. They don't have to. You're not an employee of theirs. They don't have to pay you anything. So they set it up like that and to disadvantage the very workers that are generating that profit in the first place. They take the profit and then they use it to hurt those same workers. And he points out that one, this passed in a deep blue state. So this law, this is an anti-worker law, anti-worker legislation, hurts workers everywhere, and it passes in a deep blue state that it has a ripple effect. If you can successfully pass legislation in California, you can pretty much successfully pass legislation anywhere. Just look at what happened with like cannabis legalization and decriminalization. And once something passes in California, you're talking about tens of millions of Americans at that point. They hold a significant portion of the population there in California. I think it's like 30 million people is the population in California. I could be wrong. I might be thinking of Texas, that's like 28, 29 million. And then that would make California actually closer to 40 million, I believe. I think that's actually right, that it's over 40 million people in California. So you got 40 million people in California, that legislation already impacts. And now that's a proof of concept to those companies that, okay, we can spend less. Every other state is smaller than, has smaller population, less ground to cover than California. In California, you got to play into you got to get ads into over 100 different media markets, because there's all these different media markets for all the different areas of California. It's like having different states essentially that they cover with their radio and their television stations. And so there's a ton of different media markets in California. So it's much harder to pass legislation in California than it is to pass it in other states. Yet they're going to be able to spend less money, and they already have a blueprint for how to do this. You just propagandize, right? And that's something that we're very familiar with here in Massachusetts, because here in Massachusetts, we are, pretty prolific at knocking down progressive legislation, due in large part to effective propaganda being used against unwitting, well-meaning individuals who are, supposedly liberal. And you would think that liberty includes things like, being able to vote for whoever you actually choose to vote for, to be able to open up your options to vote. But we just knocked down ranked choice voting in Massachusetts because it was so effectively propagandized against. We also did it with safe patient limits. For nurses, there was a great bill that would have passed in California, actually. And all the studies were there. All the research studies have been done in California, saying that was effective legislation to give safe patient limits to nurses, that would have said, just limit how many patients a nurse is allowed to see in one, per shift or at a single time, which it increases the demand for workers. It forces hospitals, in order to meet that demand, to hire more nurses in. And the studies had proven this out. And, the propaganda came in, the propaganda machine comes in, it says, oh no, it's going to be terrible for nurses. It's going to, the hospitals are going to shut down because they're not going to be able to make up, and hire enough nurses to staff this properly. And it's total BS. And the reality is that hospitals are running at profit right now. And all it means is that they would have less profits is all. They would have to hire more nurses, and it cuts into their profits a little bit. And those people effectively propagandize. You should be very, very wary of when you hear radio ads or television ads for anything. Like, please, hopefully nobody on the show is voting based on advertising. You got to understand who has the money to do advertising. It's the moneyed interest. Typically, it's going to be the capitalist class that benefits from media markets and things like that. So we have to, do our own research and make sure, don't go voting on things that you don't understand. Definitely inform yourself, or just leave that line blank and let people, that have the time and the privilege of researching these issues, vote on them. Don't let yourself be propagandized to, and don't just hear a radio ad or a television ad and then make a decision to vote based on that. Do your own research. And if you can't do the research, I really urge you to abstain from voting, and so that people can see, listen, it takes less votes in order to pass this legislation, and it allows it, it encourages, I believe, grassroots campaigns, because they can say, okay, at least we're not trying to go out there and have to get 10,000 votes. We only need 1,000 votes to pass this legislation. And so we just got to convince 1,000, people. And so try to avoid voting on things that you're not familiar with. Like Richard Wolff said, these were well-intentioned people. They run ads that are like, you want to help these, these poor unemployed workers. They're not going to be able to have, if we classify them as employees, we're not going to be able to hire them anymore. It's going to cost too much, and we're not going to be able to employ them. You're not going to have flexible hours anymore and things like that. No, you can do flexible hours as an employee. You could still have systems where you let people come to work, check in anytime they want. There's no rule that says that if somebody's an employee, they have to be scheduled for a particular time every day. There's no rule that says that, but they can propagandize in that way. And it was very effective propaganda. So any thoughts on that, Kwame?
It really takes me back to the nurses, to the safe patient limits. And that was such a major key, what you said, because when I think back to that, it was a very clear thing. Like, the nurses that I personally knew were all talking about it. They were going out and trying to spread awareness and whatnot. But that wasn't what you were seeing on TV. And a lot of the times you were seeing those ads of the nurses who were coming out against it. And it was usually people higher up with the at the hospital with the financial
administration,
interests, the admin, posing as nurses all the time, every time. And look what happened there, and this is a common thing. Like you said, when you see an advertisement on the radio or those ones on TV, there's spin on that. There's spin on that. They're not biased. If it's telling you one way to vote or the other way to vote, then it's not unbiased. You need to go research both sides of it and come to and get someone, a trusted voice that you follow, to kind of steer you in the right direction, so that you're not falling into that propaganda machine. Like, get trusted sources, and if they don't have a stance on it, have them point you to their trusted sources. But and if not, then like Kamali said, just abstain. The one time I'll tell you, just abstain. Abstinence works
absolutely.
In this case.
Yeah. What Up America says, I'm not sure any of those gig platforms would even be profitable if the workers were W-4. Yeah, that's the thing. Like, those gig platforms right now a lot of them are not running at a profit right now. They are existing off of investor cash right now, and they are running at a loss, and they're doing it intentionally to grab all the market share that they can, monopolize. They just want to become a monopoly, because once you're a monopoly and you knock out all the other competitors, if you can get enough funding, then you can run at a loss, which Amazon's able to do. So Amazon does this all the time, right? Like they can sell something at a loss for a long time in order to price out all of the competitors out of the market. Once all the competitors are gone, then you're the only distributor of a product, then you jack up the prices, so this is what they're going to do. They're just doing a grab for market share right now. And so they run at a loss right now, even as they are right now. They purposely run at a loss. Video game companies do this often. They sell their platforms at a loss, knowing that they can make up for it in accessories and in first party games that they sell. So they will run at a loss. Absolutely. So they know that they're selling this. The platform costs more to build than what they sell it for, but they know that they're going to be able to make up for it through, again, those microtransactions, those accessories. That's where they really make their margins. And they
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, what that does is that makes it so that it's impossible for smaller competitors to come up, because your average small business can't compete in that way. You can't run at a loss. We, average people can't afford to run at such a great loss to ourselves. We can't build up a platform like that, because it's not just based on, it's not a profitable business as it stands. It's actually being propped up by investor cash that, they get billions, invested into them. Hundreds of millions and billions of dollars invested in them, and they can leverage that cash and use that to as a buffer for them while they run at a loss, and they price out all the competitors, and then eventually there's only one or two left in the market, and then that's where you can see things like surge pricing from Uber and all this other stuff come in, and you have no other choice, because it's like, well, what else am I going to do? We've already knocked out all the taxi businesses. They're all flailing right now, and so there's less taxis to operate. So now your only choice is to get an Uber or a Lyft at this stage. And that's when they really start to jack prices up and stuff. And so, no, they're not profitable right now. And they almost certainly wouldn't be profitable with their employees, treating these people as employees. But that's the whole point, is that maybe this isn't a profitable business. It's not something that people should be doing if it's not profitable. Or we agree this is a public service, and the government should, take over these businesses and run them as nationalized businesses, where we can then say, what, we don't do this because this is mass transit, and it's like what we need is to produce better mass transit systems instead, and be looking at public transit systems and putting our funding there, instead of relying on these private, profit devouring industries or whatever, or corporations. And so I agree that what were you gonna say, Kwame?
And it's bad for everyone when you look at it. You look at regular Uber and Lyft and all of the assaults and just all of the terrible things that have happened because they can skirt by on the background check. Because they don't have to, they could just, their butt's not on the line. They just cut their loss and cut the guy off and blame it. He's an independent contractor. And it's bad for when you look at Uber Eats or DoorDash, which I'm guilty of using a lot of too, as a resident fat guy. It's terrible for the restaurants. A lot of the restaurants don't make any money or a lot of money off it, but they have to do it to stay competitive, because all of their competitors are on DoorDash and Uber Eats, and no one's calling directly to the restaurants anymore. It's bad for everyone. Contract work, for the most part, when it's something like a major company classifying their employees as contractors, is always terrible. Go holla at the WWE and all the shit that the terrible, awful things that have been allowed to go on, the terrible treatment. This is the place that's famous for having employees who work 360 days a year. So like they're
doing like really grueling, dangerous work too, like very physical.
Their bodies, their minds.
And when you're a contractor, you're not protected by things like unemployment insurance or health insurance. They're all required to go get that stuff for themselves when they can label you as a contractor. And that's what Richard Wolff was talking about there, that this has a ripple effect outward, not just from state to state, where they're going to be able to do this in more than just California. They're going to be able to do it across the country, but it's other industries that are going to be able to also begin to latch on to that law and say, hey, we have precedent the WWEs of the world can use the same exact legislation to say, we don't have to pay you. You're a contractor for us.
Not just the WWE, it's already happening in video games. A story came out recently that was talking, and this has been a company that I have been, they're a large corporation, so they do bad things. I do recognize the good things that Microsoft does, where they do pro-consumer moves, even if it's for their bottom line. But this is one thing that they have been called out for recently, is they've been doing a lot of contract work in the to skirt around hiring people on as full-time employees, giving them benefits. They have like I'm pretty sure one of the largest pools of contract work in the gaming industry. And that seems to be something that, as more people are talking about unionizing in that industry, seems to be something that more people tend to be leaning towards, is this contract work. And it's just bad business. It's bad news. It's bad news. There's no protection there. It's bad for the employees, and it's gonna affect all of us eventually if we continue to allow this to happen. It really is.
Yep, exactly. This is bad for all workers. It's not just about California workers. It's not just about Uber workers. This is bad news for workers everywhere. And this is a major, major blow to labor, and we should recognize it as such. And just pay attention to these things, because they have ripple effects outward, and they ultimately impact all of us.